This video is sponsored by Raycon. In preparation for Robert Pattinson's new Batman film, today I will be reviewing every live-action Batman movie from the 20th century. Yep, that's right, all of them. I don't know anything about Batman. This has been one of the most difficult videos I've ever made, and I'm about to show you all how Batman changed from this into this. So, before I collapse from exhaustion, let's review every live-action Batman film from 1966 all the way to 1997. This is my review of classic Batman. Please, for the love of God, subscribe. As some of you might remember, in December and January I reviewed every live-action Spider-Man film. I'd been a Spider-Man fan since before I could remember, and due to that, I was able to rely on a base level of knowledge I had concerning the character. However, when it comes to Batman, I have quite literally less of an idea about him than most people in the world. I have never read any of the comics, watched any of the old TV shows, any of the animated series, or the vast majority of the films, save for two. I did see The Dark Knight in theaters for a friend's birthday, and I saw Batman v Superman on a complete whim with my ex-girlfriend, and neither of us had a good time. And well, you see, that's kind of a problem because I have to review all of these films. How can I write a review if I have no idea who the character is and by proxy have no idea if the portrayal of the Batman in these films are accurate and speak to the essence of that character? Well, the answer is I couldn't review them. And so it seemed I needed some help. Enter AJ.
You're a big guy.
For you.
AJ is a massive Batman fan and compiled for me a list of the most fundamental and critically acclaimed Batman comics for me to read. And so I did my homework. And in my studies, something came to my attention. Batman undergoes a change, a considerably large and fundamental change in the 1980s following the initial flamboyant and goofy run from 1939 all the way up to the 1970s. Unlike the more modern interpretations of the character, the majority of the Golden and Silver Age, otherwise known as the pre-70s material, is largely disconnected, formatted as a series of self-contained one-off issues, and as a result, there weren't really any story arcs for me to sink my teeth into, which stands in direct contrast to what I have available for me today. Nowadays, the Batman brand is as iconic or perhaps even more iconic than that of Superman in some cases. However, back in the 1960s, this wasn't the case. In fact, Superman would routinely sell far more comics yearly than Batman would. At the turn of the decade in 1960, Batman was the 6th best-selling comic. The following year, it was the 7th, and by 1965, Superman stood atop the comic book world, all the while Batman had slipped down to 9th place behind the likes of Archie and 3 separate Superman spin-offs with the likes of Superboy, Superman's girlfriend Lois Lane, and Superman's pal Jimmy Olsen, selling far more copies than Batman that year. Let me repeat, Superman's pal Jimmy Olsen sold 100,000 more copies than Batman in 1965. I mean, I have no idea. Jimmy Olsen could be a really cool character and I don't even know. However, this was all about to change, for on January 12th, 1966, a show so amazing, so influential, and more iconic than anything the MCU has released to date would hit the screens of millions of homes across the United States and indeed, the rest of the world. I am of course alluding to the single greatest children's TV show of all time, Adam West's Batman. Following its release, Batman received an enormous boost in pop culture appeal, and by July of that same year, Batman received his very first live-action flick. And in all seriousness, it might be one of the funniest movies I've ever in my life seen. Batman, 1966. The 1966 Adam West Batman film is a cavalcade of wackiness that quite literally defined the term camp when applied to superhero film, turning any and all apparent theatrical or ostentatiousness from the original comics run all the way up to 11. This film is bonkers with a capital silent Q. I know I normally break down these kinds of films based on their narrative or creative merits, but I feel like doing so with this film would do a disservice to this magnificent work of art and indeed all of you. For instance, the first 10 minutes of this film acts as a quick introduction to what exactly we'll be getting ourselves into for the following 104 minutes. It does not pull its punches in being exactly what you might think it is. We get a pole to the Batcave that dresses them up in their iconic, albeit cheap-looking crime-fighting costumes. We have the Batmobile, which produces fire out the back that clearly isn't doing anything. There's the Batcopter, which is clearly a regular helicopter with bat paraphernalia haphazardly strewn across it. And to my surprise, we even get a fleeting glimpse of Batman's famed shark repellent spray, which naturally blows up a shark. Now, before I go ahead and ignore the plot of this film for the next 3 minutes, I'll quickly explain for those of you who haven't seen this work of art. Batman and Robin try to stop the Riddler, Joker, Catwoman, and Penguin from doing something evil for about 104 minutes, with some of the loosest applications of logic I've ever witnessed in my life. There's a clear and concerted effort made to make this some of the most harmless television available, while also trying to deal with romantic relationships, kidnapping entanglements, hostage situations, and a host of other incredible circumstances. For instance, a little over halfway through this film, in an effort to surprise attack Batman, Penguin dehydrates his minions into dust, and once inside the Batcave, rehydrates them. However, something goes wrong. With even the slightest touch, the rehydrated minions flash out of existence, and the following is Batman's explanation for what just happened. I quote, "Whoever dehydrated those pirates could not have foreseen their accidental rehydration with the heavy water we used, which naturally left them in a highly unstable condition. The slightest impact was sufficient enough to reduce them to antimatter." Antimatter? You mean they won't be coming back, Batman? And to that, Adam West delivers one of the most sobering line deliveries in all of film.
No, Robin. Not in this universe.
I think part of what makes this film so incredible and weird to me isn't how crazily it's written, or even how every performance is more over the top and sillier than the last, but it's Adam West's almost deadpan performance of Batman. It sincerely feels as though he's treating this as if he's in line for an Oscar. He has the strangest performance and delivery I've ever seen from any actor in this film. And this is a film with Mickey from the Rocky films dressed as a Penguin Man, and Cesar Romero as the Joker, clearly putting makeup over his very pronounced mustache. Now, on a more serious note, apart from the obvious visual flamboyance that colored the screen during this picture, what I found most interesting about the film, and indeed the Adam West Batman character, was how it came into existence. With the Batman comic book and character having been released during the years of the Second World War, Batman and Superman comics were both vehicles of escapism for a growing population of people in North America. And this was felt all over the entertainment industry back in the 40s and 50s, with a lot of the focus placed on producing live-action war-inspired films and TV shows. However, by the time the 50s were coming to an end and the 60s were on the horizon, a lot of different studios began investing into crime-fighting or horror-based shows, such as the still somewhat popular Addams Family. The network ABC was struggling at the time and needed their, quote, Addams Family if they were to future-proof their station, and looked into comic books for a solution. And their first choice was... it was Superman. I mean, of course it was. Superman was one of the most popular comics at the time. However, the rights to Superman were otherwise entangled in something else. A Superman musical, which sounds like the best worst idea I've ever heard. Needless to say, it eliminated that option for ABC. Which brought us to the second choice they had, which was Dick Tracy, a comic strip about a good guy cop trying to stop bad guys, and once again, the rights weren't available. And so ABC went with their third choice, Batman and Robin. And when it came to finding the best man to play the role of Batman, Charles Fitzsimmons, associate producer for the show, said, "It was a tough search for actors because you had to find an actor who was prepared to play Alice in Wonderland as though it were Hamlet." However, they eventually found their golden boy, and after having scouted him by way of a Nestle commercial of all places, Adam West ended up becoming a magnificent fit for their vision of the hokey and over-the-top Batman character we know and love today from that TV series and movie. Following the roaring success Batman enjoyed courtesy of what I am now calling the Adam West effect in 1966, Batman's comics too enjoyed tremendous success with the general public, routinely besting even Superman's sales in the years 1966 and 1967, overall selling more copies than any other property in North America. However, this wasn't all good news in the eyes of Batman's longtime fans, with the show having been created by a person by the name of William Dozier, a man that seemed to detest the very concept of comic books.
Fucking Batman, innit?
and so authenticity to the source material wouldn't have been something that would have been high on his priority list, and thus the show we know and love today was produced. And before I continue, there's a brilliant video chronicling the journey of Adam West Batman over the channel on NerdSync if you're interested in the topic. I'll leave the link in the description. But in it, he says, while reflecting on the vision the fans at the time had on the property, the show turned Batman, who was a serious literary character, into a national laughingstock. The Dark Knight was hip and popular across the country because he was presented as a joke. The television series defiled their Batman. And even their comic books weren't safe from the Adam West effect.
Holy ravioli!
Slowly as the years trickled on by and Batman comics flew off the shelves, the over-the-top catchphrases from Robin such as "Holy, holy, holy Batman" would make their way into the comics, as well as the over-the-top encounters and imagery. However, after the TV show concluded on March 14th, 1968, so too did Batman's reign at the top of the comic book world. With Batman continuing to fall in popularity as the years marched forward into the next decade, it seemed as though the world's idea of Batman had been marred in the eyes of many lifelong fans by this Looney Tunes version of The Dark Knight. However, as the 70s marched onwards into the 80s, it became apparent that the once flamboyant and colorful characters that decorated the screens of the comic books in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s wouldn't cut it for audiences with a more modern sensibility. And so, it was at this time a decision was made to reinvent the character of Batman in a fashion we had never before seen, with a much more grizzled, adult, and realistic approach, which thankfully led to the creation of 1987's Batman Year One. This is the quintessential modern origin story for Batman, with it serving as the basis for basically any and all modern interpretations of the character. This was the very first Batman comic I ever read, and it was far more engaging than I ever expected it to be. It's not overly long, has a compelling story with a clear vision, and delivers upon it in an incredible way with some stunning panel work and immersive world building. And while I loved Adam West Batman, it was through this story I really felt as though I began to understand who and what Batman truly was. And this very comic's influence was not only felt in the comic book industry, but through every subsequent Batman film to be released from that point onward, starting with Batman 1989. Hello everyone and welcome to the very first Batman film I can actually review as a film and not as a meme. Between the years of 1978 and 1987, Superman once again led the way on the big screen with feature film success, with the first film entitled Superman grossing a massive $300 million at the box office. However, with Superman 2, Superman 3, and even Superman 4 producing increasingly disappointing results at the box office, it seemed that the culture among young Americans of the time were shifting from the uplifting and bright to something a little more gritty, and it would appear that a certain character that had recently been the recipient of a major overhaul was now primed for a spectacular worldwide release. Tim Burton and Michael Keaton's Batman set the world ablaze upon its release and marked a pivotal moment in the genre of superhero films. Taking home well over $400 million at the box office, it was clear that the world was ready for more Batman. But was the movie any good? I don't know, let's take a look.
Fucking Batman, innit?
Alright, so I went ahead and watched both of the Tim Burton films, and boy do I have some opinions. In short, I liked the 1989 version well enough. I enjoyed Keaton's aloof and charming performance as Batman, and Nicholson did a tremendously unique and entertaining job portraying the clown prince of crime. However, it was the second one that really impressed me, and I can't wait to explain why in just a second. So, let's talk about the first of these two films to kick this off. From a visual and lore standpoint, I can see some similarities with Burton's imagery and the Year One material, and certainly the origin of Batman, which bookends this film. I also enjoyed how the first time we see Keaton's Batman, he's positioned and written to strike fear into the hearts of Gotham's criminal underworld. This too is incredibly close to the comics in spirit, particularly the entrances he makes through the smoke. Furthermore, and this is an aspect of the story I really liked, the film loves to bask in Bruce's lavish lifestyle, however, not just for the sake of it, but to instead drive home a point to us watching that his living situation is deeply depressing, dark, and lonely. Highlighted specifically through a dinner date scene which moves from a big dark room on a long table to a much cozier and intimate setting alongside Alfred, his only family left in the world. It's a nice short scene that grants us a glimpse into the life of Bruce Wayne, and this is an aspect of the film I wish they leaned more on. There is of course some great stuff concerning his past, with him protecting a family to kick off the film and his leaving of 2 roses where his parents died, but I wish we got more of that in this film, seeing as it's his debut feature.
I'm Batman.
Jack Nicholson's Joker is quite different and much more human than the comics depiction. Nicholson really does make it his own though, and he's got the perfect face for it. That smile is truly the stuff of nightmares. Nicholson's Joker runs a crime syndicate, and in the middle of a heist, they get cut off by the cops and Batman before forcing him to fall off into chemicals, and in the process, the Joker is born. Something I wasn't really a fan of, however, with Burton's Joker was how much we actually got to learn about him personally. In the comics, he's much more of an agent of chaos, a mystery, a calculated lunatic running amok. And one of my favorite aspects of the Joker is how much of a mystery he is. Hypothetically, if the origin we see removes that mystique from the character, then all that's left is a comparatively less interesting character in my opinion. As a result, Burton's Joker, to me at least, felt far more human and, dare I say, flawed in an understandable and human sort of way. With that said, however, Nicholson's depiction is utterly chilling, with cartoonish music juxtaposing the more gruesome and grotesque acts he commits. His laugh wheezes not unlike nails on a chalkboard with a bassy whisper that's as grinding as a growl. The elements he brings to this performance are uniquely his own creation, as is the character largely, which I think plays a big part as to why he's so fondly remembered today. It's a fittingly unsettling and cartoonish performance that I was very much a fan of. Unlike the comics, I was surprised and sort of disappointed with how small a role Commissioner Gordon played in this feature. In Batman Year One, Gordon is one of the two main characters. He delivers and is responsible for a large amount of the criminal exposition, the culture within the police force, and indeed Gotham at large. In this film, however, that exposition is largely facilitated by a character I'm not too familiar with called Vicky Vale. Performed by Kim Basinger, I personally found this character and performance to be relatively dull in comparison to other supporting characters we'll be sure to get onto in the next film. One thing though that did take me off guard with this film was its incredible soundtrack, courtesy of none other than Danny Elfman. If you haven't seen these films, this is the man responsible for scoring the Raimi Spider-Man trilogy. And having never seen this movie, I wondered myself why I had heard this music before, and then realized it too was present in Batman the Animated Series while I was growing up. Which again, I didn't really watch, though it was on from time to time.
I have taken off my makeup. Let's see if you can take off yours.
Overall, I liked this film, but I wouldn't say I loved it. The performance from Jack Nicholson was fun and entertaining, oftentimes carrying the feature during the more energetic moments through extreme exaggerated poses and even dancing. That said, Keaton delivered a very good Batman performance as well, with an appropriate level of charm and cool factor to help sell the part effectively. I did think that the supporting characters at the newspaper were intensely boring at times, and the action sequences felt surprisingly flat for me, though the Batmobile and other such Bat accessories were appropriately cool to see in action. I think I'll largely chalk down the stilted action to the clearly very restrictive neck on the Batsuit. And so in closing, if a 5 out of 10 is a meh score, I'd say this one lands at a 6 or a 6.5 out of 10 for me. I liked it, but I thought there were a few moments where I felt the film really showed its age, which it's allowed to do. This was, after all, one of the first films to blaze a trail for the current superhero films released today. So, without further ado, let's move on to the sequel that really surprised me.
Yeah, but first a quick word from our sponsor.
If you're in the market for new wireless earbuds that offer the same sound quality as premium brands at half the price, then Raycon's everyday earbuds are exactly what you need. They look, sound, and most importantly, feel better than ever. Each pair comes with their fantastic optimized gel tips that give you the perfect in-ear fit. I use these while I exercise all the time, so trust me when I say, not only are they super comfortable, but they will not come out of your ears even during the most intense sessions. I've spoken in the past about how rarely I need to charge them, but it cannot be overstated. With 8 hours of constant playtime and a total 32 hours of battery life, they're always ready to go when you need them. And it's no wonder they've become so popular. These earbuds have over 48,000 5-star reviews, and it's easy to see why. With a 45-day happiness guarantee, you can try them totally risk-free, but honestly, you won't need it. They're great. So if you're interested in hearing for yourself, click the link in the description box or go to buyraycon.com/notmark to get 15% off your Raycon order. Batman Returns. Alright, we're here in 1992. I'm 1 year old. I can't speak in full sentences yet, and this film gets released. Fast forward 30 years and I find myself watching it now. And my god, did I think this one was better than the last. While I enjoyed Batman in this sequel and found Penguin to be much more enjoyable than the Joker from 1989, I will say that by far what carried this film for me was Michelle Pfeiffer's portrayal of Selina Kyle's Catwoman. What a stunningly entertaining performance from her and a brilliant depiction from Tim Burton. Totally perfect for this film. In preparation for this movie, I read up a little on the Penguin and Catwoman's comic counterparts as they both played pivotal roles in this flick. For the Penguin, I read a short story from the first issue of Joker's Asylum. Narrated by the Joker, this short comic offered valuable insight into the more cerebral aspects of the Penguin's psyche, and illuminated why he's one of Batman's most fearsome adversaries. I should also mention that there's a critical difference between this modern incarnation of the character and the pre-70s era version, which depicted a fat man armed with an umbrella performing goofy somersaults. In this short comic, I discovered the crippling adolescence that transformed Oswald Cobblepot, a young boy yearning to feel accepted, into the Penguin we see today. A crime boss plagued by a deep sense of inferiority and contempt for those that would dare laugh at or ridicule him. I very much enjoyed the character and thus was interested in seeing how Tim Burton would handle him. In addition to researching Penguin, as I mentioned, I looked into Catwoman too. For her, I was told to read Batman Year One, which I did, and perhaps more helpful than that was Catwoman When in Rome, a comic published in 2005 that works as a great follow-up to another comic, Dark Victory, which I'll reference later on for Batman and Robin, but for now, Catwoman When in Rome acts as my framework for what Catwoman ought to be like as a character, and my god, does Michelle Pfeiffer knock it out of the park. And while I'm talking about both Catwoman and Penguin respectively, I think an interesting component to this narrative is that both of these characters are both shunned by society to varying degrees and encouraged to stay small and hidden away in their respective corners, either psychologically or directly. Take Penguin for example. Cast away into the sewers by his aristocratic parents shocked by his deformities, Oswald is saved and raised by penguins underneath the Gotham Zoo, and once the time is right, he makes his presence known in more ways than one. However, this aspect of exploring shunned souls is particularly apparent through Catwoman specifically. Selina Kyle, a meek secretary to an evil, abusive man. Her input laughed at, her demeanor demure, and her prospects limited. However, she experiments with increasingly more unhinged and extreme actions, starting off with something minor and eventually graduates to full-blown murder as she expresses the full extent of her autonomy onto the city that kept her subservient. I want to speak more on these two in just a sec, but I didn't do this with the last film, so I have to do it now. Can we talk about Tim Burton for just a second? If you thought Tim Burton's artistic stylings were perfectly apparent in the first film, then this one will straight up assault your senses with the Burton-ness on display. Having broken box office records with his outing on Batman 1989, this film more than shows how his confidence as a creative has grown. Now, I'm not an expert on Mr. Burton by any stretch of the imagination, but hey, I like The Nightmare Before Christmas and Beetlejuice, so I'll give it a shot. While I was in art school, Tim Burton was someone I looked up to quite a lot. Not necessarily in terms of style, though I did think it was very cool, but more so in terms of philosophy. Looking through his sketchbooks from his schooling and college years, it's clear to see that this style we all know and associate with Burton today was alive and well inside his brain long before he even made a theatrical release. He never felt compelled to be anything else other than himself. And when I, as well as hundreds of other artists, had clear visual inspirations for our work that all looked very similar, it was really cool to see an artist that naturally stood out from everyone. His dedication to exaggerated proportions, haunting and gaunt expressions, and intense shadows having permeated his earliest work all the way through to today, and this Batman sequel was no different. While it was abundantly clear who produced this film in '89, with its intense use of shadows, moody set dressing, and predilection for uncomfortably distorted camera shots, I did feel as though there was a certain level of restraint being applied here, like he was afraid to fully commit to something which wasn't his own. Having only produced one film prior to this that felt intensely Burton, I suspect that following the tremendous success of the first Batman film, he may have felt as though he had earned the right to enjoy a freedom of expression with this one. And so, cue the gross imagery, gangly proportions, grotesque shots, and, returning, now more intense than ever, are the pitch black shadows and smoke that cloak this world of Gotham. This first act of the film is great. It establishes two primary villains, Penguin and Shrek, with the latter's plan to not distribute energy across Gotham, but to instead suck the power from the city in order to bring it to its knees and therefore depend highly on him. But interestingly, there's very little Bruce Wayne and Batman in this film's first 45 minutes outside of a brief fight scene within which the Batmobile does most of the fighting. I'm not knocking that aspect of the film, by the way, I just found it interesting. That said, I do like that there seems to be equal parts dedicated for Bruce to flex some of his investigative strengths in trying to come to grips with what in fact is going on. Danny DeVito's portrayal of the Penguin is horrifyingly brilliant, and there are a few scenes where I felt they matched the comics nicely, and certainly more than Nicholson's Joker did. Once again, a man manipulated by society, forced to be something that he's not in order to get something he should have had from the beginning, a sense of belonging, going about getting what he lost or feels like he's owed in all the wrong ways. We can understand him, but not justify what he's doing, and while there are obvious differences between this Penguin and the one we saw in the comics, unlike Nicholson's great, albeit unique portrayal of the Joker, this performance from DeVito really stays true to the spirit of the modern Penguin character, I felt. Particularly during this scene with Shrek as he tries to convince him into becoming mayor of Gotham in order to help leverage and elevate his own position. The final act of this film is fittingly silly in nature, with Penguin fixing all of the various species of penguin in his possession with explosives to destroy the city of Gotham. However, Alfred of all people sends them all back to the sewers, saving the city. So, in short, Alfred kinda saves more people than Batman across all of these films. Now, before I move on to Batman Forever, I want to dedicate some time to Michelle Pfeiffer's Catwoman here. Catwoman is by far and away the single best part of this film, I think. I enjoyed Michael Keaton's inoffensive portrayal of Batman. He has plenty of charming moments, and I think he plays the role quite well when compared to the comics. Danny DeVito's Penguin, I think, is even better, with his physical appearance being morphed by Burton's taste so perfectly, and his motivations and dialogue so in keeping with the Penguin's character. However, Michelle Pfeiffer's Catwoman is the 10 out of 10 chef's kiss performance that carried this film for me. From the very first time she hits our collective screen, she holds her attention tightly in her claws. I thought long and hard about why I felt more of a connection to and interest towards her than any other character in these films, and eventually the answer became clear to me. Of all the main characters in these films, Batman, Joker, Penguin, so much of what drives them are outside forces leading them to becoming reactionary characters. Why does Batman get involved? Well, because he's reacting to the Joker, Penguin, or other such villains committing crimes. Why did Joker act? Well, it was partially to do with him wanting to get revenge and partially out of jealousy towards Batman. And why did Penguin act the way he acted? Because of the contempt he had for the world who shunned him. He opened himself up and would react to the manipulations of Catwoman, the jeers of the city, and eventually the actions of Batman. But Catwoman's entire character here is about freedom. She consciously skirts and flirts with the line dividing villain and antihero, all the while being exactly what she wasn't at the beginning. An autonomous, active agent in her own life and this film. Once upon a time, she did not live for herself. At the beginning of this film, we're greeted by a woman subservient to an employer that belittles her. When we see where she lives, we're reminded constantly how her social and familial life is being stripped away from her because she feels beholden to others. However, once she becomes Catwoman, she becomes her own hero. Someone that exacts her own agency over the plot. She very rarely reacts to what others do, and when she does, it's a pivotal moment that catches her off guard as well as everyone else in the scene. And following those moments, her composure visibly shakes. Instead, in this film, she almost always acts out of her own self-interest, driven by her desire to please herself in the moment, instigating much of the plot by way of the Penguin and various other encounters. At the very end of the film, she ends up killing her former employer in spectacular fashion. She's been betrayed by society, and despite Batman's best suggestions for what the correct course of action should be here, she ignores him. She's in control of her own destiny and does what she wants. She's not taking orders from anyone anymore, playing into the 9 lives of the cat trope, absorbing bullets all the while reciting the children's rhyme, staggering closer and closer until...
How about a kiss, Santa Claus?
Using the weapon she took from her attacker at the start of the film, the moment that signified her first step into doing something for herself, she takes out the person she once served in devastatingly psychotic fashion. While I do think this film is far sillier and perhaps a little bit more stilted on a narrative level, particularly when you consider how little Batman actually has to do with this story, Catwoman is still an unbelievably fun character and the best in this film. And to be clear, that's really not to take from the other fantastic performances here. It is just to say that in my opinion, she elevates this film far higher than it otherwise would have been without her. I mean, there's a scene where her character has to hold a bird in her mouth, and when watching it, I thought that was a fake bird, but when I watched the behind behind the scenes, it turns out that this was a very real bird. And Michelle Pfeiffer shot that scene several times. For several takes, she held a real bird in her mouth. Michelle Pfeiffer in this role, I believe, is unmatched. Careful, yet reckless, driven by instinct, yet playful. Just as cats do.
Meow.
Batman Forever. Well, this is different. What the hell happened? Is what I can imagine a large number of people thought when the marketing for this film kicked into high gear. New actors, new director, new everything. This was the very first of the Batman films I remember being advertised to me while I was a kid. I think I had some VHS tapes with the ad for it at the beginning. Man, remember VHS tapes? Couldn't escape the ads even then. Needless to say, after what I thought was the best Batman so far in Batman Returns, I was so surprised they changed the approach so completely that I had to do some research to discover why. And I found out why. Was the answer satisfying? No, not really. Do I kind of understand it though? Yeah, for sure. When my dad brought me to see Spider-Man 1 in 2002, he did so with the expectation that this was a superhero flick and therefore a film for children. And while it was great for children, it was also something that he could enjoy, much to his surprise. During the early 90s, however, superhero films very much had that stigma, seen predominantly as films to be geared towards a younger demographic, with advertising tie-ins to fast food chains and of course merchandising galore. These were massive revenue streams for these films, and as a result, a lot of time was dedicated to advertising the films prior to their release through these channels.
Can I persuade you to take a sandwich with you, sir?
I'll get drive-through.
I'll get drive-through. That's the first actual line in the movie, and it's there exclusively to serve as this ad for McDonald's. But I digress. Following the release of Batman Returns, while there was a considerable amount of praise for that film, Warner Brothers, the rights holders for the film and the ones who make all the decisions including overseeing direction and scripting, they made an oopsie. You see, remember when in Batman Returns we have the hypersexualized Selina Kyle, some light body horror through Penguin biting someone so hard that they bleed from their face, and of course, at the very end where he bleeds from his mouth and then dies. Yeah, remember all that fucked up stuff? Yeah, well, that was a film that was advertised towards children too. And as a result, Warner Brothers were the recipient of some unsavory calls from disgruntled parents. With that said, however, the film was labeled PG-13 in the States and 15s where I'm from, so I think it's kind of the parents' fault personally. Batman Returns wasn't the 2-hour toy advertisement Warner Brothers were expecting, and despite Burton being eager to sign on for another film to complete his trilogy, or to at least get a trilogy, he also felt as though his vision was no longer welcome there, and so signed on as a producer instead for the next film, with Warner Brothers looking to gear the next installment specifically towards younger kids, and as a result, hired Mr. Joel Schumacher to direct. The resulting script was enough to push Michael Keaton away from the project, with him claiming that the script, quote, sucked, and in response to that glowing endorsement, Val Kilmer signed on to take up the mantle as Batman and Bruce Wayne, and what followed was a film with aspects I liked and aspects I really didn't like. To prepare for this, I read up on a few new characters that this film introduced to me: the Riddler and Robin. I began by reading a comic called Four of a Kind for Edward Nygma's Riddler. Through that, I learned a great deal concerning his childhood, revealing his motivating factors, his insecurities, and his traumas. Then finally, I discovered Dick Grayson, otherwise known as Robin. Dark Victory was the comic I read to come to grips with who he was and what he represents for the character of Batman 2. Two-Face is in this film technically, but I just really hated Tommy Lee Jones' Two-Face here. I've seen The Dark Knight, and to be honest, I prefer to give my impression on the character of Two-Face and Harvey Dent in that film for obvious reasons. And besides, we have plenty to talk about in this one. Alright, so what are my thoughts on this film? Well, I can imagine that for many out there, it's a pretty divisive one. Loved and hated by many in equal measure. I can totally see children watching this film and getting a great kick out of it. The fight sequences are a lot more out there and experimental, if not very silly. The set pieces and set designs were massively different, clearly demonstrating a ton of different iconography and time having been put into them. Particularly when it comes to the character of Edward Nygma, the Riddler, who I kind of loved in this. And I feel like that might be a controversial statement. But then again, it does make sense because there are plenty out there who find this era of Jim Carrey plenty annoying. Personally, this era of Jim in the early 90s was the only aspect of this film that I felt a connection to on a nostalgic level, and there I think is where the reasons lie for my take on this. If you have nostalgia for this film, then I can well imagine you having a great time with it well enough. However, when you're like me and you're seeing it for the very first time in your 30s, then it's a bit of an acid trip coming off the back of Batman Returns. Jim Carrey's performance as the Riddler is a crazy combination of his Ace Ventura character combined with the cable guy, the latter of which I enjoyed but not many other people did. Regardless, Kerry really throws himself into this role, and without him I think I would have had a much more difficult time watching this movie. The Edward Nygma character is handled a little heavy-handedly for my liking by the script, however, with Eddie's first scene effectively talking his character's motivations to us on screen in place of a more natural starting point showing us his admiration for Bruce instead. But I did enjoy his deep-rooted sense of inferiority and desperation to be noticed for the genius he believed himself to be, with his living quarters reflecting that very aspect of his persona. A crazy amount of work and energy tucked away in a small, narrow room, underappreciated and underutilized just like how he feels. Furthermore, I think I liked Kerry in this as much as I did because of how this film is made too. Everything looks like a toy or a cartoon at times brought to life, which can be a good or a bad thing depending on your tastes, and while Tommy Lee Jones looks like he's either phoning it in or trying way too hard, Jim Carrey, the living cartoon himself, really hits the sweet spot, I think, for what this film was trying to achieve. And speaking of Tommy Lee Jones, as a quick aside, apparently during the filming of this movie, Tommy Lee really didn't like Jim Carrey.
Great, I went over and I said, "Hey Tommy, how you doing?" like that, and the blood just drained from his face.
Switching gears and speaking on the Robin character for just a sec, I will say that this movie really killed any and all sense of drama and atmosphere I felt with the Robin character.
Well read and just a little wild. Ooh, if only someone could tame him.
And funnily enough, they kept it far closer to the original when telling his story than I thought they would too. In the original, Robin is part of a circus act as the Flying Grayson's family of acrobats, who get caught up as collateral damage from an organized criminal attack, causing their equipment to malfunction, leading to them falling to their respective deaths. Of the family, Robin is the sole survivor, and Bruce, seeing himself in Robin's suffering, takes him under his wing and guardianship to help him avoid the life he ended up leading. That's a wonderful dynamic, and while it's technically here, the fashion with which it's carried out is odd, and that's the charitable reading of the events. There's less of a tragic atmosphere and more of a loony and cartoonish one. In the comics, we were bathing in a more harrowing and tragic occasion, whereas this uses it as a means with which to link the Riddler and Two-Face together while forcing Dick Grayson, the Robin character, to contend with a comically sized bomb. And while it leads to the same relationship between Batman and Robin, the age of Dick in this film, played by a 25-year-old Chris O'Donnell, again makes the occasion feel less akin to Bruce's experience, as Robin at this point is a grown-ass man. And if that didn't ruin the character, Robin is hyper annoying both in this film and certainly the next. Which is a shame, I thought, because one of the few criticisms I had for the prior films was that I wish they'd spent more time exploring the traumas and backstory of the main character, Bruce Wayne. The foundations of that character are precisely why he does what he does, and it's that motivation that makes him such an interesting character when grappling with the morality of his violent actions, in addition to wondering if he could or should take lesser or more extreme steps in order to prevent further harm on other individuals. He's totally unlike Superman and Spider-Man, and it's that flavor which is explored in this film specifically. Behind the thick layer of cheese, toy commercials, and product placements is a story I could have really sunk my teeth into. And apparently there was a cut of this film which was 45 minutes longer, and one could assume contained within it were parts of the actual storytelling that didn't hold any value on a merchandising level for the studio, but held a considerable amount of narrative importance or significance for the plot to enrich it. Alas, we shall never know. I'm only now realizing, by the way, that I never gave my score out of 10 for Batman Returns, so let's say I give it a 7 or a 7.5. I really enjoyed that film, thanks predominantly to Catwoman. This film, however, I'd be more inclined to give a 4 out of 10. The film overall is wacky in a charming but mostly intrusive way. The most irritating characters by far are Two-Face, followed shortly after by Robin, neither at any point passed the vibe check, with Tommy Lee Jones being the standout failure of this picture in my opinion. I enjoyed the Riddler for what he was and thought he should have been the sole villain in this story. And the biggest surprise was that Val Kilmer's Batman, I kinda liked him, despite the cringy script. Overall, the film has some interesting and ambitious ideas with regards to the various characters they demonstrated, but the modern incarnations of these characters are built upon much more realistic foundations than what this film and the studio felt comfortable with exploring or bringing to life. Interested more in creating a living cartoon for children than an engaging story that, while faithful to the comics, would also capture the minds of both young and old alike. And with the next film, instead of trying to find a happy medium between Batman Returns and Batman Forever in terms of tone, we got a happy medium between Batman Forever and absolute insanity. I introduce you to 1997's Batman and Robin. Alright, so look. 1997's Batman and Robin scored a flaccid 12% on Rotten Tomatoes, secured a $238 million box office against a $160 million budget, and is widely considered one of the worst superhero films ever made.
If there's anybody watching this and went into Batman and Robin with great anticipation, if I disappointed them in any way, then I really want to apologize.
To be clear, we are talking about a film that performed so poorly and received such a bad reception that Warner Brothers cancelled their next Batman film entitled Batman Unchained, and instead settled for rebooting the series in 2005 with Batman Begins and the Nolan trilogy. And I can see why.
Didn't you apologize to the crowd at Comic-Con for Batman and Robin?
I always apologize for Batman.
Speaking as someone that started this video with virtually no basis or knowledge of the Batman series and spent countless hours researching, reading, watching, and writing about them over the last month so that I can apply it to these films, I can safely say that for this film, it has been an enormous waste of my time. For example, Poison Ivy is a character that plays a leading role in this film, and in preparation for her, I dedicated some time to try to figure her out by consuming this short but brilliant comic from 1986 called Poison Ivy: Secret Origins. This was the comic that redefined the character from her campy Golden Age era persona into the tragic heroine she's known as today. And furthermore, this is a comic book that understands and has a passion for the character. Written by someone that could take the perspective of a convicted murderer, of a psychopath, and accurately and charitably convey her perspective for us not only to understand, but also connect with. Like, check out this page for example. On this page, our point of view character, Stuart, asks Poison Ivy why she's chosen her name to be Poison Ivy, the name of a weed, when she herself admits to having a passion for all things botanical. Her response is concise, but illuminates so much about her as a character. She says, there's no such thing as a weed. A weed is just a plant some human decides is growing in the wrong place. What an outstanding line. This is what it looks like when a writer is talented and cares about these characters. It's why we look to passionate people online for their takes on these things they love, because through these people we can see these stories and characters in a new light. And none of that nuance or interest is in this movie. Instead, we get bat nipples and close-ups of George Clooney's perfect ass. And speaking of George Clooney, one upsetting thing about this film for me was that George Clooney was in the role of Batman. And not because I don't like George Clooney. I'm actually a fan of his work. The Descendants and Fantastic Mr. Fox are great films in their own right, and Oh Brother, Where Art Thou happens to be one of my favorite films of all time. So, let me be clear, I like me some Clooney, but this script is not only broken on a narrative level, but totally misses the point of Batman's character that the last film managed to get right to some extent. So, in short, this film makes me hate George.
I always apologize for Batman.
Any hint of struggle or trauma behind Batman's eyes have been replaced by some cheeky smirks and about 30 different dad jokes. If there's anything this last month of reading and studying Batman has taught me, it's that following the facelift the series received in the 80s, all the best characters in the story are ones rooted in or tangentially connected to some sort of personal trauma. Batman, Poison Ivy, Dick Grayson, Riddler, Catwoman, Penguin. Heck, the only one who isn't directly tied to a trauma is the Joker, and something must have happened to that dude for him to turn out the way that he was. This is a story rooted in reality and dark subject matter, and this film threw all of that out the window in favor of...
What killed the dinosaurs? The Ice Age!
Iceman was an utter disaster of a character and shared no resemblance to his comic or animated series counterparts for that matter, reduced to a single muscle-bound, overly glitzy, laughable series of ice puns. And look, I know this movie was geared towards children, but through Iceman's ice-capades in this movie, all it did was leave me isolated as a viewer. But look, it's no problem. And okay, I would try to cram one more ice pun in here, but it slipped my mind, so let's move on. Unlike the prior film where I had my issues but was able to find some positives, this film strips the story of any semblance of weight or value for me. It makes Batman worse, Dick Grayson even more annoying, and filled itself with villains that are either insulting or intolerable. And this film technically has Bane, by the way, a character that's supposed to be a genius in both body and mind, someone that's famous for being the one who broke the bat in both body and spirit. Not some mindless zombie that's pumped full of weird steroid stuff. I can't imagine what this film must have been like for fans of Batman back in the day, but right here and right now, I'm giving this disaster of a movie 1 out of 10. I really did not like any part of this film. And that does it Those are all the live-action Batman films from before the millennium. Quite the journey, but we're not even halfway yet. Next week, I have 7 more films to review. Catwoman 2004, the Nolan trilogy, BVS, Joker, and Justice League. And my team won't let me see anything other than the 4-hour Snyder cut of the Justice League. This is going to be a long week, but until then, I've been totally not Mark. I hope to see you all there. Same bat time, same bat place.